The last presentation is from Alessandra Gaffuri. She is a veterinary here in Italy, and her talk will be about the Italian Alps as a case study for a One Health perspective. Now I move and give you my place.
Che va giù però, questo che è il contrario a quello che penseresti.
Good morning. Thank you, Annalisa, for your introduction. I would like to thank the scientific committee for giving me the possibility to talk about the latest research in the Alps from a One Health perspective, examining the role of wildlife and its diseases. In particular, I'm grateful to Dr. Luca Pelliccioli, who took part in the making of this presentation and in some of the research I will present. Also, the definition of One Health has already been covered in previous presentation. I would like to highlight how, for a correct approach to One Health, it is necessary to replace an anthropocentric view of the world with an ecocentric one. This is because in the former view, nature is merely a reserve for humanity to exploit in order to meet their own needs, whereas in the latter, humans and nature is seen as a part of an interconnected system, and therefore equal attention is given to health, ecosystem, wildlife, domestic animals, and humans. In this cycle, wildlife health hasn't been taken into account in relation to humans and the ecosystem health issue. Wildlife serve as an important indicator of the health of the environment it lives in. It is a bioindicator for the presence of bacteria carrier of antimicrobial resistance and of environmental pollution. Wildlife is also increasingly involved in the transmission of infectious disease to domestic animals, but the opposite also is true, especially in the Alps, where wild ruminant and livestock often share the same pasture, as you can see in this picture. Moreover, wildlife can transmit a plethora of pathogens to humans and vice versa. In a paper published in Nature in 2008, Kate Jones estimated that out of about 300 emerging diseases in recent decades, 60% were zoonotic, and of these, 72 originated in wildlife. Wildlife is also important for biodiversity, and the abundance of some wild species can cause wildlife and human conflict. For this reason, the relationship between human, wildlife, and livestock is important, with link to the deep change in the mountains ecosystem, where there was a natural increase in wildlife population, especially ungulates, as well as an increase in sport and exploitation of the environment by humans for leisurely purposes. These factors, along with the climate change, may increase interspecific contact and the transmission of diseases. There has been an increased interest in research in wildlife diseases in the last 2 decades, as you can see in this graph, starting when the terms One Health wasn't as common yet, with particular attention toward the interaction between wildlife and livestock. In recent years, many bestsellers raised awareness among readers about the transmission of diseases from animals to humans, like spillover, highlighting how the lifestyle changes can expose humans to a greater variety of animals, which can sometimes have terrible consequences. Now, I'd like to present this research project as a case study for a One Health approach about tuberculosis by Mycobacterium bovis that affected wild deer in some Austrian and German regions. The pathogens was transmitted from cattle to deer, and the diseases then spread in the species. 4 countries were involved in the project, including neighboring countries of Italy, Switzerland, and Austria. The presence of the disease resulted in the spread of Mycobacteria bovis in the environment, with the risk to pass to other wildlife species. There was also risk of transmission to humans, especially to hunters during the carcass handling, as well as to livestock. From an economic standpoint, this situation had a repercussion on hunting sector with a hunting restriction and limited cattle trade. In Italy, especially in the Alps, veterinary surveillance plans have been put in place since the last 19th at local and regional level. In this plan, we can distinguish a scanning or passive surveillance performed on wildlife found edge and delivered to veterinary laboratories for the diagnosis of the cause of death, and the targeted or active surveillance performed on hunted wildlife with planned disease investigation depending on the species. The samples are collected by hunters during hunting season and delivered to laboratories. Among the investigated diseases, the tick-borne diseases and the meat-borne pathogens are particularly relevant. Ticks are arthropod vectors of several pathogens that can cause severe disease in animals and humans, as Lyme disease, and you can see in the picture the typical migrant erythema, and tick-borne encephalitis. Their increased presence in the Alps, also at a higher altitude, is mainly due to climate warming, abundance of host population, and habitat fragmentation. Another urgent issue is the control of game meat to prevent human exposure to meat-borne pathogens. The project Selvatici e Buoni, Wild and Good, by the University of Colenso and the Veterinary University of Milan in the Bergamo province is an example of what can be done. The aim of the project was to increase the quality of game meat from a safety and organoleptic point of view by training hunters in carcass handling and assessing meat-borne pathogens such as toxoplasmosis and hepatitis E, and implementing waves to promote consumption and enjoyment of game meat. Enhancing this kind of supply chain is a great opportunity for economic development in marginal mountains areas. To achieve effective results in wildlife monitoring, it is important to create a solid collaboration between partners and stakeholders, starting from people who work in the fields, like stay in the fields and observe animals, such as hunters and gamekeepers, through training and communication. As an example of cooperation, in this picture you can see how, after detecting an hill ibex, it was possible to capture him and to collect samples to diagnose the disease. But as mentioned during the last and recent European Wildlife Disease Annual Association conference, it is important to expand the field network of wildlife surveillance by implementing new sources of observation. We need to find new communication strategies that encourage the public's participation in environmental research. This can be achieved through citizen science, This approach must be specifically addressed, for the example, towards an habitat or a specific soils, in order to reduce bias or inaccuracy as much as possible. In this sense, the Citizen Sign project, sponsored by Alpine Climber Bergamo and coordinated by Luca Pelliccioli, is an interesting example. Through photographic contest, it was possible to monitor the distribution of ibis population and its health, to detect very common and pathogens that can affect wild species, such as Mycoplasma conjunctivi, that cause a disease unfortunately very famous in the alpine ruminant. In conclusion, this presentation aimed to provide examples of the importance of wildlife monitoring, and especially of disease monitoring from a One Health perspective, and to offer strategies for intervention to make the environment safer and build a better future. A globally coordinated strategies are required to spot and stop outbreaks before they can spread across the world. Most important priority must be identified in order to act as effectively as possible. And the key message is think global, act local. This phrase can be used in many contexts, but from a One Health perspective, we do think that only many individual local action can help the concept of One Health become reality. And thank you for your listening.
Okay, thank you, Alessandra, for this very interesting communication.